The wind coming off the harbor smelled like diesel and low tide, and Dr. Farrah Doyle had timed her coffee runs to avoid exactly this. The sight of Jonah Pruitt's truck parked crooked outside the clinic, 2 hours before his shift, like he had nowhere else he'd rather be. "You're not on the schedule," she said, not looking up from the intake binder. "I know." He set a second coffee on the counter anyway, the way he'd been doing for 3 weeks now, ever since the ferry accident that had put them both elbow deep in the same set of injuries for 6 straight hours. "Figured you'd be here." That was the problem. He'd figured right. And she'd let a pattern start that she hadn't authorized, hadn't planned for, hadn't wanted. A rescue diver showing up on his off days with coffee that was exactly the right amount of too sweet, because somewhere during that accident, he'd noticed how she took it and never asked again. Cold Harbor, Maine, wasn't a big town. The clinic sat 2 blocks from the pier, and half of Farrah's patients were the same fishermen and dive boat crews who filled the tavern on Friday nights. Jonah was search and rescue, contracted through the county, which meant their paths crossed on bad days. Capsizes, hypothermia, the occasional diver who'd pushed a tank past its limit. Professional paths. Paths with rules. She'd written the rules herself, more or less, the year she took over the clinic from her father. Never let a rescue call become a relationship. Adrenaline lied. It made people mistake gratitude for something else, made them cling to whoever had pulled them out of the water, and she'd watched 2 colleagues burn out chasing that particular high. She wasn't going to be a third. "You can leave the coffee at the door next time," she said. "I don't need an audience for morning intake." "You didn't need an audience during the ferry pull either, but I noticed you work faster when somebody's counting compressions out loud for you." He leaned against the counter, unbothered, the kind of calm that came from years of talking scared people through cold water. "I'm not angling for anything, Farrah. I just like this town's coffee shop, and it happens to be next to your clinic." It was a lie so thin she almost laughed. Almost. The trouble was, she liked the lie. She liked that he remembered her coffee order, liked the low rasp in his voice when he talked her through triage on the pier that day. Steady, unhurried, like the world wasn't ending even when it clearly was. She liked, most of all, that he never once made her feel like the doctor who'd frozen for 4 full seconds when she saw the size of the gash on the ferry captain's leg. He just stepped in, filled the gap, and let her recover her hands. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, there had been coffee, and a shared bench at the pier during a slow Tuesday, and one evening where a summer squall trapped them both under the clinic awning for 20 minutes, close enough that she'd counted the raindrops sliding off his jaw instead of doing anything useful with her mouth, like speaking. Her sister called it inevitable. "You've been alone on purpose for 4 years, Deb had said over the phone last week. "That's not virtue, Farrah. That's a moat." Maybe. But moats existed for a reason, and Farrah had built hers stone by stone, mostly out of the wreckage of watching her father marry a woman he'd met while she was still his patient's daughter. A relationship that started in a hospital corridor and ended in a custody fight that had swallowed Farrah's entire adolescence. She knew exactly how these things could rot from the inside if nobody drew a line early, so she drew one now. "If you want to keep bringing me coffee," she said, closing the binder, "bring it as a friend. Not as somebody who pulled a boat captain out of the water and decided that means something about the 2 of us." Jonah didn't flinch. Fair. He studied her for a second longer than the word needed. "For what it's worth, the coffee started before I decided anything. I just liked watching you work. Steadiest hands I've seen come off a bad call in 8 years on this coast. Didn't need saving from anything to notice that." She hated how much that landed. Hated it the way you hate a wave that knocks you down exactly when you'd stopped bracing for one. The real test came in October, when a nor'easter chewed up the coast for 3 days straight, and the clinic turned into a triage floor for half the fishing fleet. Jonah worked 40 of those 72 hours, and on the second night, Farrah found him sitting against the supply closet, jaw tight, favoring his left shoulder in a way he thought nobody had clocked. Dislocated it pulling a kid out of the surf, he admitted, when she crouched in front of him and he ran out of ways to dodge her eyes. "Popped it back myself. It's fine. It is not fine, and you know better than to self-reduce a joint in the field." She kept her voice level, clinical, because the alternative was letting him see how much her hands wanted to shake. "You're going to let me look at it properly, and you're going to sit still while I do." "Bossy," he said, but he let her ease the sling into place, let her fingers map the joint with a care that had nothing clinical left in it by the end. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. The storm rattled the windows. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse was arguing with a fisherman about tetanus shots, and none of it mattered as much as the 6 inches of space between her face and his. "You keep doing that," she said quietly. "Getting hurt, saving people, and pretending it doesn't cost you anything. You keep doing that too. Treating everyone in this town like they're your responsibility and never letting anybody carry a piece of it for you." He caught her hand before she could pull it back, not gripping, just holding, giving her every chance to leave. "I'm not asking you to change the rule you made for good reasons, Farrah. I'm asking if the rule still fits, or if you've just been too stubborn to check." She thought about her father's hospital corridor. She thought about 4 years of drawing lines so clean nobody could ever accuse her of the mess he'd made. And she thought about how none of that history was actually about her and Jonah. It was about a wound she'd been guarding so long she'd forgotten to ask whether it had already healed. "Ask me again when the storm's over," she said. "When it's not adrenaline talking. I want to know if this is still true on a boring Tuesday." "Deal." He didn't let go of her hand yet, "but I want it on record. I've been showing up on boring Tuesdays for 3 weeks already. This was never the adrenaline talking. That's just when you finally looked up long enough to notice." The nor'easter passed. The fleet came home. And on a gray, unremarkable Tuesday 2 weeks later, with no emergency, no rain, no excuse of any kind, Jonah walked into the clinic at closing time with 2 coffees and no urgency in his stride at all. And Farrah realized that was exactly the test she'd asked for, and exactly the answer she'd been afraid to want. She came around the counter, took both coffees out of his hands, set them down, and closed the last of the distance herself. Because some questions, she decided, deserved to be answered with something more honest than words. The porch light caught them both a moment longer before she reached over and switched it off, leaving the rest of that boring Tuesday exactly where it belonged, between the two of them and no one else. Maybe her father's corridor romance had been reckless. Maybe Deb's moat comment had been fairer than Farrah wanted to admit. Either way, she'd learned there wasn't a clean formula for knowing when caution turns into hiding. You just have to be brave enough, on some ordinary, unremarkable day, to find out.